The sun rose gently over Ouagadougou, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. The early morning light cascaded across the terracotta rooftops, illuminating the bustling streets where vendors were already setting up their colorful stalls. The air was thick with anticipation and the fragrant aroma of freshly baked bread, mingling with the earthy scent of the African soil. This was no ordinary day for Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré had organized an international business summit, the first of its kind since his rise to power. His dream was bold yet simple: to unite African and international investors to create stronger opportunities for African entrepreneurs, to build bridges where walls had once stood, and to prove to the world that Africa was ready to take its rightful place on the global stage. The grand conference hall in the heart of the capital was a sight to behold. Magnificent chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light across the polished marble floors. Elegant banners bearing the colors of Burkina Faso, red, green, and gold, adorned the walls. The energy in the room was palpable, electric with possibility. Business leaders, CEOs wearing expensive suits, diplomats in their formal attire, and journalists clutching notebooks and cameras had gathered from across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The clicking of cameras echoed through the vast space. Microphones buzzed with static, and the sound of excited conversation filled the air like a symphony of hope. Everyone was waiting with bated breath for the arrival of the president. The security detail had been meticulously planned. Guards stood at every entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd with professional vigilance. Outside, the streets had been cordoned off, and a small crowd of citizens had gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of the historic event that would shape their nation's future. Inside the hall, translators adjusted their headsets, ready to bridge the linguistic gaps between French, English, Arabic, and various African languages. Technical staff made last-minute adjustments to the projection screens that would display presentations from various countries and companies eager to invest in Burkina Faso's future. Then something unexpected happened that would change the course of the entire summit. A sleek silver private jet descended gracefully onto the runway of the nearby airport. Its polished exterior reflected the morning sun like a mirror, announcing wealth and power before its passenger even emerged. The plane bore no national markings, only a discreet logo that suggested private ownership of the highest caliber. The crowd at the event venue turned their heads as a convoy of 3 gleaming black SUVs with tinted windows approached the conference center. The vehicles moved with practiced precision, their synchronized movements suggesting military training. Security personnel straightened their postures, curious about this unannounced arrival. When the door of the middle vehicle opened, a young woman stepped out, and it seemed as though time itself paused for a moment. She was tall, graceful, and strikingly beautiful, with an air of confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her designer dress, crafted from the finest silk, moved elegantly with each step. Diamond earrings caught the light, and her perfume, subtle yet expensive, reached those nearby before she did. Her name was Sarah Dupont, a millionaire businesswoman from France. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the crowd like wildfire. Rumor had it that she had built her fortune in technology and international trade, starting with nothing and rising to prominence in less than a decade. Some said she had connections to the highest levels of European government. Others claimed she was a self-made genius who had revolutionized digital commerce in Africa. She was only in her early 30s, yet she had already accomplished what many could only dream of achieving in a lifetime. Forbes had mentioned her name in their lists. Though never in the top rankings, she seemed to prefer operating just below the radar of intense public scrutiny. What caught everyone's attention wasn't just her wealth or her beauty. It was the confidence she exuded, the way she carried herself as though she belonged everywhere and nowhere all at once. She walked into the hall as if she owned every square inch of it, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, echoing with each purposeful step. All eyes followed her movement through the crowd. Journalists whispered urgently to each other, checking their phones and tablets for any information about this mysterious woman. "Who is that?" one reporter muttered to his colleague. I heard she flew in from France just for this event, another responded, rapidly typing notes. Did you see that jet? She must be incredibly wealthy. That's at least a $50 million aircraft. More than that, someone else interjected. That model is custom built. You can't just buy it off a lot. She probably has connections we can't even imagine. Sarah smiled politely at the onlookers as she made her way to her seat near the front of the hall, in the VIP section reserved for the most important guests. Her assistant, a young man in an impeccable suit, followed 2 steps behind, carrying a leather briefcase that likely contained documents worth millions. But what nobody noticed except the president, who had just entered from a side door, was that her gaze never left him. From the instant he stepped onto the stage, she observed his every movement with an intensity that went beyond mere interest. Her eyes tracked him like a predator studying its prey, calculating, measuring, planning. President Traoré felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm room. He had spoken at numerous international meetings throughout his career. He had addressed the United Nations, negotiated with world leaders, and faced down hostile journalists. But nobody had ever looked at him this way before. This wasn't admiration from a supporter or curiosity from a journalist. It was something deeper, something that made him instinctively uncomfortable, a mixture of fascination, confidence, and perhaps something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. He tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the task at hand. This summit was too important to be distracted by one peculiar guest, no matter how wealthy or beautiful she might be. The speeches began promptly at 10 o'clock, as scheduled. The Master of Ceremonies, a distinguished diplomat from the African Union, took to the podium with practiced ease. Distinguished guests, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this historic gathering," he announced in French, his words simultaneously translated into multiple languages. "Today marks a new chapter in African economic development, a testament to what we can achieve when we work together across borders and cultures." One by one, business leaders approached the microphone, each making their pitch and their commitment to supporting Africa's development. The presentations were impressive, filled with colorful slides showing projected growth rates, infrastructure plans, and employment opportunities. A German automobile manufacturer pledged $10,000 and promised to explore the possibility of opening an assembly plant in West Africa. A Chinese technology firm offered $50,000 and spoke of digital infrastructure development. An American investment group committed $25,000 toward agricultural modernization. Each pledge was met with polite applause, and President Traoré nodded gratefully at each contribution, understanding that even modest amounts represented commitment and partnership. He knew that building trust was more important than securing massive sums immediately. The presentations continued for nearly 2 hours. Some speakers were eloquent and passionate, others more reserved and technical. The audience listened attentively, taking notes, asking questions, gradually building the foundation for future collaborations. Then came Sarah Dupont's turn. The moment her name was announced, a subtle shift occurred in the room's energy. People sat up straighter, craned their necks to see better, adjusted their recording devices. She rose from her seat with deliberate grace, moving to the podium with the confidence of someone who had addressed boardrooms and government officials countless times before. When she spoke, her voice was calm, elegant, and carried effortlessly across the hall without seeming to strain. "Mr. President," she began in flawless French, her smile soft and disarming. "Distinguished guests, it is an honor to be here today in this beautiful country." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience before returning to President Traoré. "I have traveled from France specifically because I believe in your vision for Africa," she continued, her words measured and deliberate. "I have watched from afar as President Traoré has worked tirelessly to transform this nation, to give hope to its people, and to prove that African leadership can be both strong and compassionate." The audience listened intently, captivated by her eloquence and apparent sincerity. "In my years as a businesswoman, I have seen many leaders make promises, but I have seen few who actually fulfill them. President Traoré is one of those rare individuals who matches his words with actions." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Therefore, it is with great pleasure and profound respect that I announce my contribution to this initiative. I would like to pledge $5 million to support economic development in Burkina Faso." The hall fell into absolute silence. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Cameras erupted in a frenzy of clicking and flashing. Journalists frantically scribbled in their notebooks or typed on their devices. People turned to each other in disbelief, mouths agape. $5 million. The amount dwarfed every other pledge combined. It was unprecedented, unexpected, and almost incomprehensible. Even President Traoré himself was rendered speechless for a long moment. He had prepared responses for various scenarios, but this had not been among them. His mind raced, trying to process not just the amount, but the implications behind it. Finally, he found his voice, though it took effort to keep it steady and diplomatic. "That is extremely generous of you, Madame Dupont," he said politely, his hands gripping the edges of his podium. "On behalf of my people, on behalf of every citizen of Burkina Faso, I thank you from the bottom of my heart." The hall erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, offering a standing ovation to this mysterious French businesswoman who had just demonstrated such extraordinary generosity. But inwardly, President Traoré's heart was heavy with questions that no one else seemed to be asking. Why would a woman he had never met offer such an enormous sum without asking for anything in return? What were her true motivations? In his experience, nobody gave away $5 million out of pure altruism, especially not to a foreign country they had no apparent connection to. His years in politics and military service had taught him to be cautious, to look beyond the surface of grand gestures. There was always a price to be paid, always strings attached, even when they weren't immediately visible. As the conference continued with remaining presentations and panel discussions, Sarah DuPont became the center of attention. During the break, people swarmed around her, congratulating her and praising her generosity. Business cards were exchanged, photographs taken, and countless promises of future collaboration made. Yet through it all, Sarah's attention remained fixed on one person. While she smiled and made small talk with various guests, her eyes kept returning to President Traoré across the room. She watched how he interacted with others, how he listened more than he spoke, how he seemed to give each person his full attention, regardless of their status or importance. When the conference concluded in the late afternoon, the crowd gradually began to disperse. Diplomats and business leaders headed to their hotels or to arrange dinner meetings. The massive hall that had been so full of energy slowly emptied, leaving behind only the event staff beginning to clean up. Sarah DuPont lingered, deliberately slow in gathering her belongings. She had dismissed her assistant, sending him ahead to the hotel with her briefcase and files. She wanted this moment to be private. As President Traoré prepared to leave through a side exit, escorted by his security detail, she approached him with calculated timing. Her smile was serene, practiced, perfect. "Mr. President," she called out softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without seeming desperate. He turned, and his security team immediately tensed, hands moving slightly closer to their weapons. But he raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. "Madame Dupont," he acknowledged, his tone professionally courteous but guarded. "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time," she asked, taking a step closer. "I promise not to keep you long." He glanced at his watch, then at his chief of security, who gave a subtle nod indicating the area was secure. "Of course," he replied. "What can I do for you?" Sarah moved closer still until they were standing just a few feet apart. The remaining people in the hall were too far away to overhear their conversation. "Mr. President," she began, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "I want you to know that my offer today was sincere, but it's also just the beginning of what I could do for your country, and for you personally." President Traoré's expression remained neutral, but internally, alarm bells began ringing. "I've admired you for a long time," she continued, her eyes locked on his. "Not just as a leader, but as a man. You're someone with vision, with strength, with integrity. These qualities are rare in today's world. I appreciate your kind words, madame, he responded carefully. But I'm not sure I understand the purpose of this conversation. I wish to know you better, she stated plainly. Not just as a leader, but as a person. I believe we could have a special connection, something that could benefit both of us tremendously. The president felt a growing uneasiness. Madame, I appreciate your interest, but I am married. My wife and my family are my foundation. My priority is and always will be my country and my people. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. It was the kind of smile that suggested she had anticipated this response and had prepared for it. But you're Muslim, aren't you? She asked, her tone suggesting this was a perfectly logical continuation of the conversation. Islam permits a man to have more than one wife. This is part of your faith, part of your culture. President Traoré stiffened, now fully understanding where this was heading. His voice became firmer. Madame Dupont, the possibility of polygamy in Islam comes with strict conditions and responsibilities. It's not something to be taken lightly or used for convenience. I understand that completely, she responded smoothly. I've done my research. I know what it entails. I'm prepared for it. I could be your second wife, Mr. President. Think about what that would mean. I could help you, support you not just financially, but strategically. Together, we could make your dream for Africa even stronger, even more achievable. The president looked at her firmly, his patience wearing thin. Madame, love and marriage are not business partnerships. They are sacred bonds built on genuine affection, respect, and spiritual connection. What you're describing is a transaction, not a relationship. But isn't everything a transaction to some degree? She countered, her voice taking on a slightly challenging edge. You need resources to build your nation. I have those resources. You need allies in the international community. I have those connections. This could be mutually beneficial in ways you haven't even considered. I thank you for your offer, he said with finality, but I must refuse. My integrity is not for sale and neither is my heart. If you wish to help Burkina Faso, I welcome that. But it must be through proper channels, through legitimate business and diplomatic relationships. For the first time, a flicker of something, frustration, anger passed across Sarah's face. But she quickly masked it with another smile, this one slightly different, more mysterious, almost knowing. Perhaps, she said softly, taking a step back, you'll change your mind someday, when you've had time to think about all the possibilities, when you realize what you're turning down. I don't believe I will, he replied quietly but firmly. We'll see, she murmured, turning gracefully and walking away, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed almost ominous. President Traoré watched her leave, a deep sense of unease settling in his chest. His chief of security approached quickly. Sir, is everything all right? The man asked, concern evident in his voice. I'm not sure, the president admitted honestly. But I want you to keep an eye on Madame Dupont, discreetly. Find out everything you can about her. Of course. Mr. President. That night, President Traoré lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of his private quarters. His wife slept peacefully beside him, her gentle breathing a normally comforting sound that tonight failed to ease his troubled mind. The encounter with Sarah Dupont played over and over in his mind like a film stuck on repeat. There was something about her that seemed false, something too perfect, too calculated. The way she had approached him, the timing of her enormous donation, the proposition she had made, none of it felt natural or spontaneous. Who really was Sarah Dupont? And why was she looking at him as though she already knew him, as though this entire scenario had been planned and rehearsed? He got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake his wife, and moved to his home office. The room was simple and functional, lined with books on African history, military strategy, and governance. A single photograph sat on his desk, his family standing together in front of their modest home before he had become president. He picked up the photo, studying the faces of his wife and children. They reminded him of why he had entered politics in the first place, not for wealth or power, but to create a better future for families just like his own. The memory of Sarah's words echoed in his mind. I could be your second wife. Together, we could make your dream for Africa even stronger. It was tempting, he had to admit, at least from a purely strategic standpoint. $5 million was just the beginning, she had implied. With her resources and connections, they could accelerate development projects, create thousands of jobs, build infrastructure that would take decades otherwise. But at what cost? His integrity? His marriage? The trust of his people? He thought about the men he had known throughout his life who had compromised their principles for temporary gain. He had watched them rise quickly and fall even faster, leaving nothing behind but scandal and disappointment. That was not the legacy he wanted to leave. President Traoré returned to bed as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. He had made his decision, one he knew he would never regret, even if it meant turning down opportunities that others would kill for. He didn't know it yet, but Sarah DuPont's arrival wasn't a coincidence or a spontaneous act of generosity. It was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated plan that could destroy everything he had worked so hard to build, not through violence or obvious corruption, but through something far more insidious, the appearance of legitimacy. A week passed since the summit, but the image of Sarah DuPont persisted in President Ibrahim Traoré's mind like an unsolved riddle. Her confidence, her words, her mysterious smile, everything about her felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. During that week, the president had thrown himself into his work with even more intensity than usual. He had visited 3 rural provinces, inspected military installations, held cabinet meetings about agricultural reform, and met with teachers' unions discussing education improvements. Staying busy helped him avoid dwelling on the uncomfortable encounter, but Sarah DuPont was not easily forgotten. International media had picked up the story of her massive donation. Headlines praised French philanthropist's historic contribution to West African development. Business journals analyzed her portfolio and speculated about her motivations. Social media buzzed with theories and discussions. His intelligence chief had delivered a preliminary report. Sarah DuPont was, on paper, exactly who she claimed to be. A successful technology entrepreneur who had started 3 companies, 2 of which had been acquired by larger corporations for substantial sums. She had investment properties across Europe and minority stakes in several African ventures. Her wealth was estimated at somewhere between $200 and $300 million. Nothing in her background raised obvious red flags. No criminal record, no known connections to intelligence agencies, no history of fraud or scandal. She was simply a very wealthy, very successful businesswoman with an apparent interest in African development. Yet, President Traoré's instincts, honed through years of military service and political survival, told him there was more to the story. On a quiet Tuesday morning, as he reviewed budget documents in his office, his secretary entered with an apologetic expression. "Mr. President, Miss Sarah DuPont is here to see you." He paused, his pen hovering over a document. For a moment, he considered refusing the meeting. But curiosity and strategic thinking prevailed. Better to know what she wanted than to leave questions unanswered. "Show her in," he said quietly. Setting down his pen and straightening in his chair, Sarah entered gracefully, dressed in an elegant white dress that seemed chosen specifically to project innocence and purity. Her perfume, light and expensive, filled the room as she approached his desk. A delicate gold necklace adorned her neck, and her makeup was subtle but perfect. "Good morning, Mr. President," she greeted him with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," he responded, keeping his tone formal and professional. "What brings you here today?" "I thought you had returned to France." She laughed softly, a musical sound that was probably intended to charm. "Oh, please, there's no need to be so serious." "I'm only here to say goodbye properly. I'll be returning to France this weekend. I've extended my stay to see more of your beautiful country." The president nodded, his expression neutral. "I hope you've enjoyed your time here, and thank you again for your contribution to our economic development program. The funds will be put to good use." "I have no doubt about that," Sarah said, then did something unexpected. She sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. She crossed her legs elegantly, her posture perfect, her gaze steady. Mr. President, I didn't come here just to say goodbye. I came because I want to understand you better. Understand me? He repeated, raising an eyebrow. Yes. I've met many leaders in my life, presidents, prime ministers, CEOs of major corporations. But you're different from all of them. Different in what way? He asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. In your honesty, she said softly, leaning forward slightly. You don't hide behind money or power. You don't play the games that most politicians play. You actually seem to care about your people. That's incredibly rare in today's world. That's what leadership should be, he replied simply. Service, not control. Responsibility, not privilege. There was a moment of silence. The sound of traffic from the street below drifted through the closed windows. Somewhere in the building, phones rang and footsteps echoed in hallways. Then Sarah leaned forward even more, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. You know, she said slowly, deliberately, a man like you deserves more. You deserve someone who believes in your vision completely, someone who can help you achieve things you've only dreamed about. President Traoré felt his guard go up immediately. Madame, I already have a wife who supports me completely. Sarah's voice took on a slightly sharper edge. I know that. But what if I could do more than just support you? What if I could help you transform this nation overnight? What if I could open doors that have been closed to Africa for generations? He leaned back in his chair, uncertain about where this conversation was heading, but determined to hear her out. I'm listening. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out an expensive leather folder, placing it carefully on his desk. The leather was soft and supple, the kind that cost more than most of his citizens earned in a month. This, she said, opening the folder to reveal a professionally bound document, is a business proposal worth more than $100 million. The president's eyes widened slightly despite his attempt to remain impassive. I want to invest directly in Burkina Faso, she continued, her voice becoming more businesslike and confident, under your personal direction. Infrastructure, technology, agriculture, education, whatever you believe this country needs most. I'm prepared to provide the capital and the international connections to make it happen. She paused, letting the magnitude of the offer sink in before delivering what she clearly considered her closing argument. And if you agree to make me your second wife, this money and much more will be at your disposal for your people. Imagine what you could accomplish. Imagine the hospitals you could build, the schools you could open, the jobs you could create. All of this could be yours, Mr. President. All you have to do is say yes. For a long moment, there was total silence in the room. Even the sounds from outside seemed to fade away. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the weight of the decision itself had physical substance. Then President Traoré stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. When he spoke, his voice was firm and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had made difficult decisions before and would make them again. Madame Dupont, he said, looking directly into her eyes, we do not do things this way here. My integrity and the dignity of this country are not for sale. Not for $100 million. Not for $1 billion. Not at any price. Sarah's face changed dramatically. The soft smile disappeared, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Her carefully maintained facade cracked just enough to reveal genuine surprise and, perhaps, frustration. I'm only trying to help you, she whispered, her voice losing some of its previous confidence. Then help us with honesty and proper channels, President Traoré replied, moving toward the door. Through legitimate investment frameworks, through diplomatic relationships, through transparent business partnerships. Not through whatever this is. He turned back to face her. Please wait here. I'll return shortly. There are some documents I need to retrieve. He left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that before leaving, the president had discreetly activated a voice recorder hidden within an ornate wooden box on his desk. It was a security measure he rarely used, installed by his protection detail for situations exactly like this. The moment the door closed, Sarah's entire demeanor changed. The graceful, charming businesswoman vanished, replaced by someone entirely different. She sighed heavily. the sound full of frustration and exhaustion, and pulled out her mobile phone with sharp, irritated movements. She dialed a number, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. When the call connected, she spoke in rapid French, her voice low but clear, assuming she was alone and safe to speak freely. "It's not working," she said, her tone sharp and professional, nothing like the soft voice she had used with the president. "He's too principled." He refused again, despite the increased offer. "This is proving more difficult than anticipated." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "No, I don't think force or pressure will work with this one. He's not like the others. He actually believes in his principles." Her voice carried a note of grudging respect mixed with frustration. Another pause. "I know what's at stake. That's why I'm still here, isn't it? But he's not motivated by money or power in the conventional sense. We need a different approach." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Listen," she continued, her voice becoming more intense. "If I can somehow convince him to marry me, I'll have direct access to Burkina Faso's gold reserves. Do you understand what that means? We're talking about more than $10 billion in untapped resources, plus control over rare earth minerals and strategic positioning in West Africa." She paused, listening. "Yes, I understand the timeline is getting tight. I just need more time. A few more weeks, maybe a month. I'll find his weakness." "Everyone has one." Her tone shifted, becoming almost clinical. "The donation was meant to establish credibility and create obligation. The marriage proposal was designed to give us legitimate access to national resources, but he's proving more resistant than our intelligence suggested. He's either remarkably principled or remarkably naive. I haven't determined which yet." At that moment, the door opened softly. President Traoré had returned, his footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. Sarah spun around, her eyes wide with shock. She quickly ended the call, pressing the button with more force than necessary, and immediately her charming smile returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes this time. "Is everything all right?" the president asked calmly, his face revealing nothing of what he might have heard. "Yes, of course," she said smoothly, slipping her phone back into her handbag. "I was just checking my messages. My assistant in Paris needs some guidance on a contract negotiation." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Of course. Business never sleeps, as they say." "Exactly," she agreed, relief evident in her voice. "Thank you for your visit, Madame Dupont," he said, his tone professionally polite but clearly dismissive. "My assistant will show you out. I hope your journey back to France is pleasant." The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This meeting was over. Sarah gathered her handbag and folder, her movements still graceful but lacking some of their earlier confidence. "Thank you for your time, Mr. President. I hope you'll reconsider my offer." "I won't," he replied simply. As she walked toward the door, she paused and turned back. "You're making a mistake. This country needs what I'm offering. This country needs integrity more than it needs money," he responded quietly. After she left, escorted by a security officer, President Traoré closed the door and went directly to his desk. He retrieved the hidden recorder from the wooden box, his hands steady despite the gravity of what he suspected he would find. He played back the recording, listening carefully to every word of Sarah's phone conversation. Each sentence confirmed his worst suspicions. This wasn't about love or even legitimate business investment. It was about access, control, and exploitation of Burkina Faso's natural resources. His jaw tightened as he listened to her clinical discussion of his country's gold reserves as though they were simply numbers on a balance sheet. Resources to be extracted and exploited. When the recording ended, he sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications. Then he picked up his secure phone and called his chief of intelligence. "Colonel Sawadogo, this is the president. I need you in my office immediately, and bring your team leader for counterintelligence. We have a situation that requires urgent attention." "Yes, Mr. President. We'll be there in 15 minutes. President Traoré stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect and serve. Somewhere out there, Sarah Dupont was likely returning to her luxury hotel, confident that her plan was still intact, unaware that her carefully constructed facade had crumbled. He thought about the $10 billion she had mentioned so casually. Burkina Faso did indeed have significant gold reserves, along with other valuable minerals. Previous governments had signed away exploration rights for pennies on the dollar, enriching foreign companies and corrupt officials while leaving the people in poverty. He had been working to renegotiate these agreements, to ensure that Burkina Faso's resources benefited Burkina Faso's people. Now he understood that Sarah DuPont's interest in him had nothing to do with admiration or attraction. It was about gaining the kind of access that no amount of money could buy, the access that came with being married to the president. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. His secretary entered. "Mr. President, Colonel Sawadogo and Captain Kabore are here." "Send them in." The two military intelligence officers entered, their uniforms crisp, their bearing professional. They saluted sharply. "Gentlemen," President Traoré began, "we have a problem that goes beyond ordinary security concerns. This involves potential foreign interference in our national sovereignty." He played them the recording. As they listened, their expressions grew increasingly serious. When it finished, Colonel Sawadogo spoke first. "Mr. President, with your permission, we should begin immediate surveillance of Madame Dupont and investigate everyone she's had contact with since arriving in Burkina Faso." "Agreed," the president replied. "But I want this done quietly. No arrest yet. I want to know who she's working with, both here and abroad. I want to know who else she's tried to compromise." "Understood." "Sir." "And Colonel," the president added, his voice grave, "if a foreign businesswoman can walk into my office and casually discuss accessing our gold reserves, then we have vulnerabilities in our government that need to be identified and addressed. We'll begin a full security review." "Mr. President." After they left, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his office, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. He had always known that being president would involve difficult decisions and complex challenges. But he had never imagined that someone would attempt to compromise him through such an elaborate personal scheme. That night, sleep came slowly. When it finally did, his dreams were troubled, filled with images of gold mines, foreign flags, and the disappointed faces of his people. 2 days later, another shock arrived that would shake President Traoré's administration to its core. One of his most trusted advisors, Mr. Diallo, a man he had known for years, someone who had stood by him during the difficult early days of his presidency, came to his office looking nervous and uncomfortable. The man's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. "Mr. President," Diallo began, his voice unsteady, I think you should reconsider Miss Dupont's proposal." President Traoré looked up sharply from the document he was reviewing, genuine surprise evident on his face. "I beg your pardon?" Diallo shifted his weight from foot to foot, unable to meet the president's eyes. "I've been thinking about it extensively, sir. She's wealthy, intelligent, and influential. If you were to marry her, she could bring tremendous benefits to our economy. The investment she's offering could transform our infrastructure within years rather than decades." The president stood slowly, his voice taking on an edge that Diallo had rarely heard. "And since our religion permits more than one wife," Diallo continued quickly, as though rushing through a prepared speech, "it wouldn't even be considered unusual or improper. Many leaders throughout history have made strategic marriages for the benefit of their nations." "Stop," President Traoré commanded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Mr. Diallo, what has gotten into you? You've never spoken like this before. This doesn't sound like you at all." He moved closer to his advisor, studying the man's face carefully. Years of military training had taught him to read people, to detect when someone was lying or hiding something. "Have you been bribed?" he asked directly, his voice cold and controlled. Diallo's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as though someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. "No, sir. I'm only speaking for the good of the nation. I'm thinking about what's best for Burkina Faso." President Traoré walked to his desk and quietly opened a drawer. He pulled out the small recording device he had used in his meeting with Sarah. The sight of it made Diallo's eyes widen in horror. "Before you continue lying to me," the president said softly, "I want you to listen to something." He pressed play. Sarah DuPont's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "If I can convince him to marry me, I'll have direct access to Burkina Faso's gold reserves worth more than $10 billion. I just need more time." The blood drained completely from Diallo's face. He stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, like a statue carved from stone. His hands began to tremble at his sides. "Mr. Diallo," President Traoré said, his voice now ice-cold, "how much did she pay you?" Tears began to well up in the advisor's eyes. His shoulders slumped as though a great weight had been placed upon them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, choked with shame. $1 million, sir." The words came out broken, filled with regret. "I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry." The president felt a sharp pain in his chest, not physical, but emotional. This was a man he had trusted, a man he had considered a friend, someone who had been with him through countless challenges and victories. "How?" he asked quietly. "How did she approach you?" Diallo wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his entire body shaking. "She contacted me 3 days after the summit. Said she wanted advice on how to better help Burkina Faso. We met for coffee. She was charming, persuasive. She talked about her vision for African development, about how political realities sometimes require unconventional solutions." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "She said the marriage didn't have to be real in any meaningful sense. It could be purely strategic, a partnership for economic benefit. She showed me projections, development plans, contracts already drawn up with major international corporations willing to invest billions if she had official status in the government. And then she offered you money," the president stated. "Yes," Diallo admitted, his voice breaking. "She said it was a consulting fee, compensation for my strategic advice. She transferred $500,000 immediately to an offshore account, said the rest would come once. Once you agreed to the marriage, and you believed this was acceptable?" President Traoré asked, though his voice carried more sadness than anger now. "I convinced myself it was for the greater good," Diallo said, tears streaming down his face. "I told myself that if the marriage was permissible under our faith, and if it brought such tremendous benefit to our people, then perhaps the ends justified the means. I was a fool. A greedy, weak fool." President Traoré walked to the window, his back to his former advisor. He looked out at the city, at the people going about their daily lives, unaware of the betrayal happening in the rooms where power resided. "You didn't just betray me," he said quietly. "You betrayed every citizen of this country. You were willing to sell our sovereignty, our dignity, our future for money." "I know," Diallo sobbed. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself. I don't expect you to forgive me either." The president turned back to face him. "You're right. I can't forgive this. Not because I'm heartless, but because some betrayals cut too deep. You've shown that your loyalty can be purchased, and a leader cannot surround himself with people whose principles are negotiable." He pressed a button on his desk. 2 security guards entered immediately, as though they had been waiting just outside. "Security," President Traoré said firmly, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Take Mr. Diallo into custody. He is to be charged with accepting bribes, conspiracy to defraud the state, and treason." "No, please!" Diallo cried out as the guards moved toward him. "Mr. President, please!" "I'll return the money. I'll testify against her. I'll do anything." "You will testify," the president confirmed. "But you'll do it from a cell." "Take him away." As the doors closed behind the guards and their prisoner, President Traoré sank into his chair. He felt suddenly exhausted, older than his years. If Sarah DuPont could corrupt one of his closest advisors so easily, how many others had she approached? How deep did this conspiracy go? He picked up his phone and called Colonel Sawadogo again. "Colonel, we have confirmation of foreign bribery targeting government officials. I need you to conduct discreet financial audits of all senior advisors and cabinet members. Anyone who has had contact with Sarah DuPont or her associates needs to be investigated." "Understood, Mr. President. We'll begin immediately." "And Colonel, we need to move quickly. If Diallo accepted money, others might have as well." We need to identify and isolate any compromised individuals before they can do more damage. That evening, President Traoré sat alone in his private study, the recording device resting on the desk before him. Sarah DuPont's calm, calculating voice still echoed in his mind, planning her exploitation of his country as casually as someone might plan a business meeting. He thought about the nature of corruption, how it rarely announced itself with obvious villainy. It came dressed in expensive clothes, speaking eloquently about mutual benefit and strategic partnerships. It offered millions of dollars while talking about helping the poor. It corrupted good people by making them believe that compromising their principles was actually noble if the stated goals were virtuous enough. Mr. Diallo had been a good man once. The president genuinely believed that. But somewhere along the way, the advisor had allowed himself to believe that the ends justified the means, that selling access to the presidency was acceptable if it brought investment to the country. It was a seductive lie, one that had destroyed countless leaders and nations throughout history. President Traoré opened his computer and began writing. He needed to document everything, every conversation, every recording, every piece of evidence. This wasn't just about Sarah DuPont or even about Diallo. This was about establishing a record, about showing his people and the world exactly what had happened and why he had made the decisions he made. The truth had to be preserved, because he knew that powerful forces would try to spin this story in different directions. Some would say he was ungrateful for rejecting such generous offers. Others would accuse him of being naive or foolish for turning down much-needed investment. Still others might claim he was using this as an excuse to consolidate power or eliminate political rivals. But the recording device on his desk held the objective truth. A foreign agent had attempted to buy her way into the highest levels of his government, with the explicit goal of gaining access to billions of dollars in natural resources. As he typed, organizing his thoughts and evidence, President Traoré found himself thinking about his mother's words, spoken long ago when he was just a young soldier with dreams of serving his country. "My son," she had said, "when you rise to positions of power, remember that your character will be tested not by your enemies, but by temptation. Any fool can resist an obvious threat. It takes true strength to resist something that looks like opportunity." At the time, he hadn't fully understood what she meant. Now, sitting in the presidential palace with evidence of attempted corruption on his desk, her wisdom was painfully clear. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. His wife entered, carrying a tray with tea and simple biscuits. She set it down on his desk and looked at him with concern. "You've been in here for hours," she said gently. "The staff is worried about you." "I'm fine," he assured her, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. She sat down across from him, studying his face the way only a spouse of many years could. "This is about that French woman, isn't it? The one who made the large donation?" He nodded, seeing no reason to hide it from her. "She's not what she appeared to be, and she managed to corrupt one of my advisors." His wife reached across the desk and took his hand. "You did the right thing. Whatever happened, whatever you decided, I know it was the right thing because I know you." "How can you be so certain?" he asked. "Because you've never made a decision based on what was easy or profitable," she replied. "You always choose based on what's right. It's why I married you, and it's why this country chose you to lead." Her simple faith in him, untainted by political calculation or personal ambition, reminded him why he fought so hard to maintain his integrity. It wasn't for recognition or praise. It was for people like her, like his children, like the citizens who trusted him to guard their future. "They offered me $100 million, he told her quietly. "For the country, not for me personally. Infrastructure, schools, hospitals, everything we've been struggling to fund. And what did they want in return?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "My dignity, our sovereignty, access to our resources," she nodded slowly. "Then you were right to refuse. Some things cannot be bought, my husband, and some prices are too high to pay, no matter what's being offered." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of peace that only comes from years of partnership and mutual understanding. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I make sure this never happens again," he replied, "and I show our people and the world that Africa's dignity is not for sale." The next morning, intelligence reports confirmed that Sarah DuPont was still in Burkina Faso, staying in the presidential suite of the most luxurious hotel in Ouagadougou. According to surveillance, she had met with several other individuals since her meeting with the president: business people, government officials, even a few journalists. President Traoré made a decision. He would confront her directly, one final time, but this time on his terms, with everything documented and witnessed. "Colonel Sawadogo," he said over the phone, "I want you to invite Miss DuPont to the State House for a farewell meeting. Tell her the president wishes to discuss her investment proposal one more time before she departs. Make it sound like I'm reconsidering." "Are you sure that's wise, sir?" the colonel asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'm certain. But I want you and Captain Kabore present, hidden but ready to respond if needed. And I want everything recorded, video and audio." "Understood, Mr. President." Several hours later, Sarah DuPont arrived at the State House in an elegant cream-colored suit, carrying a small designer handbag that probably cost more than most cars. Her face carried the same confidence as before, perhaps even more now that she believed Diallo had been working on her behalf. "Mr. President," she greeted him warmly as she entered his office. "I'm so pleased you wanted to see me before my departure. I was beginning to think our last conversation had ended things permanently. Please." "Have a seat," he replied quietly, his tone neutral and unreadable. She sat gracefully, crossing her legs as she always did, her posture perfect. "I must say your country is quite beautiful. I've enjoyed my extended stay. The people are warm and welcoming." "Before you leave," the president said, his voice calm and measured, "there's something you should listen to." He pressed a button on his desk. Sarah's own voice began to play through the speakers, clear and damning. "He's too principled." He refused again. "If I can convince him to marry me, I'll have direct access to Burkina Faso's gold reserves worth more than $10 billion. The color drained from Sarah's face. The confident smile vanished, replaced by genuine shock and growing horror. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles turning white. "Where did you get that?" she stammered, her voice no longer smooth and controlled. "That was a private conversation." President Traoré leaned forward, his expression calm but his eyes hard as steel. "It was a private conversation that took place in my office, Miss DuPont, during a meeting where you came under the pretense of saying goodbye. A meeting where you proposed that I compromise my integrity and my country's sovereignty." She tried to speak, but words failed her. Her mouth opened and closed uselessly. "You came to my country," he continued, his voice quiet but carrying the full weight of authority, "with deception in your heart. You made a generous donation not out of compassion or desire to help, but as bait. You attempted to buy your way into the highest levels of government, with the explicit goal of gaining access to billions of dollars in natural resources that belong to the people of Burkina Faso, not to you or whoever sent you." Tears began to fill Sarah's eyes, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling completely. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This wasn't supposed to go this far. I was just following orders." "Orders?" President Traoré's voice sharpened. "From whom? Who sent you here?" She shook her head, tears now streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I can't tell you that. They would destroy me, my business, my reputation, everything I've built." "You should have thought about that before you agreed to this scheme," he replied coldly. "You came here to test me, to test my loyalty, to see if Africa could be bought like some commodity at auction." "It wasn't like that," she sobbed. "I mean, yes, that was part of it, but I also genuinely admire what you're doing. I thought maybe we really could work together, that it could be mutually beneficial. By accessing $10 billion in gold reserves?" he asked pointedly. "That was your idea of mutual benefit?" She couldn't meet his eyes. "I wanted to prove myself useful. To them, to you, to everyone. I wanted to show that I could deliver results. I didn't fully think through what it would mean, what I was really doing." President Traoré stood looking down at her with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Tell them," he said firmly, "that Africa is not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Tell them that there are still leaders on this continent who cannot be bought, corrupted, or compromised. Sarah tried to speak through her tears. Please, Mr. President, don't ruin me. I admit I was wrong. I see that now. I didn't mean to harm you or your country. I was just trying to succeed at an impossible task. He looked at her for a long moment, the silence heavy and oppressive. Finally, he spoke. I have nothing against you personally, Miss DuPont, but I cannot and will not allow anyone, not even you, to play games with my country's destiny. Here is what will happen. We will return the $5 million you donated. Every cent. And from this day forward, you are banned from entering Burkina Faso. If you attempt to return, you will be arrested immediately. She wiped her tears, reality finally setting in. Her power, her money, her connections, none of it mattered anymore in this place. You're making a mistake, she said quietly, a trace of defiance returning to her voice. The world will see you as ungrateful. People who were willing to invest in your country will think twice now. The world will see me as a man who chose honor over gold, President Traoré replied. And any investors who are deterred by that fact are exactly the kind of investors we don't want. He pressed a button on his desk. 2 security agents entered immediately, professional and efficient. Please escort Miss DuPont from the premises and ensure she leaves the country within 24 hours. Monitor her movements until she's in the air. As the security agents approached, Sarah stood on shaky legs. She looked at President Traoré one last time, her eyes red from crying, her perfect appearance now disheveled. For what it's worth, she said softly, I really did admire you. That part was real. If that were true, he replied quietly, you would have approached us honestly, through proper channels, with respect for our sovereignty. Instead, you chose manipulation and deception. She had no response to that. As she was escorted from the office, photographers and journalists who had been quietly alerted captured images of her tear-streaked face, a stark contrast to the confident, glamorous woman who had arrived at the summit just weeks earlier. After she left, President Traoré remained standing at his window, watching the courtyard below where her car departed under armed escort. Colonel Sawadogo entered the room. Sir, we've secured all the recordings. We also found evidence that she contacted at least 3 other cabinet members, though none besides Diallo accepted her offers. Good. Make sure those 3 officials are commended for their integrity, and make sure the recordings are preserved and copied to multiple secure locations. Already done, sir. The president turned from the window. Colonel, I want you to prepare a comprehensive report on this incident. I want it thorough, detailed, and completely transparent. We're going to release it publicly. Sir, the colonel looked surprised. Are you certain? This kind of exposure could create diplomatic complications with France and other countries. I'm certain, President Traoré replied firmly. The people deserve to know what happened here. They deserve to know that their government stood firm against corruption. And the world needs to see that Africa is not the same place it was decades ago. We will not be bought, manipulated, or exploited, not anymore. That evening, as the sun set over Ouagadougou, President Traoré sat alone in his office, contemplating the week's events. His communications director had drafted a statement for release, but he wanted to review it personally before it went out. The sound of rain began to tap gently against the windows, a soothing rhythm that helped him think. He thought about Mr. Diallo, now in detention, his career destroyed and his reputation shattered. A cautionary tale about the price of corruption. He thought about Sarah Dupont, likely sitting in her hotel room right now, preparing to leave in disgrace, her mission a complete failure. But most of all, he thought about his country and its future. This incident had revealed vulnerabilities in his government, but it had also demonstrated strengths. 3 officials had been approached with bribes and had refused. His intelligence services had worked efficiently, and he himself had passed a test that many leaders throughout history had failed. His communications director knocked and entered. Mr. President, the media is asking questions about the leaked recording. What should we tell them? President Traoré turned slowly from the window. Tell them the truth, exactly as it happened. Tell them that the leadership of Burkina Faso cannot be bought with dollars, gold, or empty promises. Tell them that we choose dignity over wealth, integrity over convenience. Yes, sir. And Miss DuPont's donation? Return it in full. I want no connection to that money. Let it be clear that we want investment, but only investment that comes through honest means and respects our sovereignty. The next morning, headlines across Africa proclaimed, President Traoré rejects $100 million bribe, chooses people over power. Social media exploded with admiration and respect. Citizens across the continent called him a man of honor. Young people shared his words, creating memes and videos celebrating his integrity. Even leaders from neighboring countries sent private messages of respect, some admitting they faced similar pressures and temptations in their own positions. International media picked up the story too, though reactions were more mixed. Some praised his principled stand. Others criticized him for turning away desperately needed investment. A few suggested he was being naive or unnecessarily rigid, but in Burkina Faso itself, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People took to the streets not in protest, but in celebration. They waved flags and carried signs, "Integrity is our wealth," and "Africa cannot be bought." Meanwhile, Sarah DuPont's face disappeared from public view. Airport cameras captured her departure, no longer the confident, glamorous businesswoman who had arrived, but a defeated figure in sunglasses trying to hide her tear-stained face. Her name, once associated with success and wealth, was now linked to scandal and failure. But deep in his heart, President Ibrahim Traoré felt no joy in her downfall. He felt only sadness. Sadness that powerful forces in the world still believed that Africa's heart could be purchased, that its leaders could be corrupted, that its resources could be exploited through manipulation rather than partnership. As he walked through the silent corridors of the palace that evening, he murmured to himself, "They test us with gold, but they forget our true treasure is dignity." The next morning arrived gently, the sun rising over Ouagadougou with a golden glow that seemed brighter somehow, as though even nature was celebrating. Birds sang their morning songs as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside the presidential palace, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The scandal had passed, but its impact lingered, not as a wound, but as a lesson learned and a victory celebrated. President Ibrahim Traoré stood by the large glass window of his office, gazing down at the capital below. He could see children walking to school in their uniforms, their backpacks bouncing with each step. Soldiers patrolled calmly, their presence reassuring rather than threatening. Street vendors were opening their stalls, arranging colorful fabrics, fresh produce, and handcrafted goods. Life had returned to normal, yet something profound had shifted. His chief of staff entered quietly, a slight smile on his usually serious face. "Mr. President, there are people gathering outside. They want to see you." "Why?" Traoré asked, surprised. "He hadn't scheduled any public appearances. They're chanting your name, sir," the man replied, his smile widening. "They're saying you've protected the soul of Burkina Faso. The crowd has been growing since dawn." The president sighed softly, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within him. "I didn't do this for praise. I did it because I couldn't betray who we are, what we stand for." "Perhaps," his chief of staff suggested gently. "But the people need heroes. They need to see that integrity still exists, that their trust in leadership isn't misplaced." President Traoré moved to another window, one that overlooked the front plaza. What he saw made his breath catch. Thousands of people had gathered, students waving notebooks like flags, elderly citizens leaning on canes but standing proud, workers in their everyday clothes, mothers holding babies wrapped in colorful cloth. They waved the national flag with pride, holding handmade signs that read messages in French and local. Langage. L'intégrité est notre richesse. Integrity is our wealth. L'Afrique ne peut être achetée. Africa cannot be bought. Nous sommes fiers de notre president. We are proud of our president. Some people were crying, tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces. Others raised their fists in solidarity and pride, young and old, rich and poor. They had all come together in this moment of collective affirmation. "I should go speak to them," President Traoré said quietly. "I think they would appreciate that very much, sir." Minutes later, the president emerged onto the grand balcony that overlooked the plaza. The moment he appeared, the crowd erupted into thunderous cheers. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a wave of human emotion that swept over everything. People were crying openly now, not from sadness but from pride. Some fell to their knees in gratitude. Others jumped up and down, overcome with joy. The elderly nodded with tears in their eyes, remembering other leaders who had promised much and delivered little, who had sold out their people for personal gain. President Traoré raised his hand, asking for silence. Gradually, the roar subsided to an expectant hush. In that moment, standing before thousands of his fellow citizens, he felt the full weight and honor of his responsibility. When he spoke, his voice carried deep emotion, amplified by speakers but genuine in its feeling. "My beloved people," he began in French, then repeated in Moor, one of the major local languages. "My brothers and sisters." The crowd listened with rapt attention, every eye fixed on their president. "We have been tested," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "Not by weapons or violence, but by something far more insidious, the temptation of easy wealth. Forces beyond our borders tried to see if our loyalty could be purchased like goods in a market. They tried to determine if Africa's dignity had a price tag," the crowd murmured, some in anger at the attempt, others in agreement with his words. "But we stood firm." His voice rose with conviction. "We stood firm because our hearts belong to this land, not to those who wish to exploit it. We stood firm because we remember our ancestors who fought for our freedom. We stood firm because we know that some things, honor, dignity, sovereignty, cannot and must not be sold at any price." The crowd erupted again, chanting, "Vive le Burkina Faso! Vive Traoré!" Their voices echoed off the buildings, creating a symphony of patriotic fervor. He raised his hand again, and again they quieted to hear him. "This is not just my victory," he said, his voice softer now, more intimate despite the massive crowd. "This is your victory, the farmers who work the land, the soldiers who protect our borders, the teachers who educate our children, the mothers who raise the next generation, the youth who will inherit this nation. This victory belongs to all of you." Tears streamed down many faces in the crowd. A mother held her young son on her shoulder so he could see this moment, so he would remember it for the rest of his life. "You remind me," President Traoré continued, his own voice thick with emotion, "that dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It must be lived every single day, in every decision we make, in how we treat each other, in how we conduct ourselves on the world stage." At that moment, spontaneously, the crowd began to sing the national anthem. Thousands of voices joined together in perfect unity, the words carrying across the plaza and beyond, reaching into neighborhoods and homes throughout the city. President Traoré stood at attention, his hand over his heart, tears finally breaking free and rolling down his cheeks. For the first time in many difficult weeks, he felt genuine peace settle over him like a warm blanket. The anthem ended, but the crowd continued to cheer and celebrate. Eventually, President Traoré waved one final time and stepped back inside. Emotionally exhausted but deeply moved. Later that evening, as the crowds finally dispersed and the plaza returned to its usual quiet state, President Traoré sat in the solitude of his office. The recording device still rested on his desk, a small, unassuming object that had saved his entire government from potential disaster. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, feeling its weight. This simple device had captured truth when lies were being spoken, had provided evidence when only allegations existed. He placed it carefully in a wooden box, locking it as a reminder of the day he had chosen honor over temptation. Pouring himself a cup of tea, simple, local tea, not expensive imported brands, he returned to the window. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, faint but steady points of light in the vast African night. His mother's old words echoed in his memory, as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "My son, When you lead people, don't let the glitter of gold blind your soul. A gentle smile crossed his face. You were right, Mama, he whispered into the quiet room. You were always right. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Come in.